Hello and welcome back. We are live from Jagex HQ, and I am joined by the fantastic Mod Sponge, who's going to be talking to us about rewards.
Cool. So I'm Mod Sponge, aka Brad. On the Combat Council currently. I'm a content developer, previously QA. Been with Jagex for 4-ish years, and I'm currently heavily involved in a large majority of the rewards that makes it into game.
Yeah, so just for some background context, the majority of the PVM related, or a number of the PVM related rewards with the Elder God Wars dungeon were designed in part by you, as well as some loot tables as well.
Yeah. So kind of from, I want to say between Rex Matriarchs and kind of Zuck, I was kind of involved with majority of the items that made it into the game at that point. And then since then, I've had some involvement in things like the Dyna Arrows, and just a large chunk, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've had a hand in a whole
Pretty,
bunch.
Yeah, kind of everything at the moment.
But if we can get into some specific ones.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
You were behind Exsanguinate and Incite Fear. I think
yes,
those were
indeed.
some early ones from City of Seniston.
Yep.
Sentiston, I should say. So what was the inspiration kind of behind those spells? Because I think they really transformed the approach to Magic and the way you play the game. So
when I got brought onto City of Sentiston, there was some vague ideas for rewards already. And it was very much, let's celebrate the past quests. So like, I think it's Temple at Sentiston, we had Ancient Curses. So like the rewards at that point were loosely upgrades to Ancient Curses. But there was kind of a roadblock there in how do you buff Ancient Curses? Like, especially when you have
already tier 99.
Exactly. When you have things like the next ones, we can't go more powerful than that, because then you just completely eviscerating the next ones,
especially
right?
As a quest reward.
Had some ideas, but ultimately it changed to where let's celebrate a different part of the same series with Ancient Magics, and we don't have to worry about that problem right now. So it very much was a homage to Ancient Magics. That's why it's obviously in the book, but introducing what is essentially upgrades that were supposed to make players feel the same way that they felt when they first did Ancients and got those. Obviously, Ice Barrage is iconic, right? Even the sound of it, I can still hear. I'm not sure if that's a nightmare or a good thing. But going from there, first designing them, they were actually kind of all the same, where they were called shift spells. And, what was the other? It was shift, and I think it was storm. So it was like ice shift, blood shift, shadow shift, and just very much following the exact same suite as Ancient Magics, but it was boring.
Yeah,
it was just the exact same thing. They had some other unique buffs, but this kind of transpired to where I wanted to do things a little bit differently and not just do flat effects and have more player interaction. So that's why with Exsanguinate and Incite Fear, you have the stack building. You have decision making on when you actually release these effects. Obviously, Incite Fear has the passive part of it, shooting out the spikes, but you also have the tsunami portion, which is obviously you have choice on when you use that. And at this point, tsunami wasn't really used. So that one of my goals was to have some lesser used abilities actually mean something again. And Ultimates is something that I personally feel kind of passionate about, because I feel like up until that point, RuneScape players were kind of railroaded into just using damage boosting ults and nothing else. So I really wanted to.
Yeah, the game has a lot of ultimates, but the majority of them are just
they're just useless.
The
exactly.
Cost.
So I wanted to make them feel useful and try to slowly push players away from the damage boosting, same rotation every time. Just get that up, unload. But yeah, that's kind of where they came from.
I think they really transformed the way that you approach playing RuneScape with Magic, just in the sense of accumulating stacks on hit.
Yeah.
And I think the big point, or the thing that made a significant difference in previous sort of stack-based reward spaces, they clear after like 5 seconds, 6 seconds.
Yeah.
And because of that, you feel like you have to consistently, let's say for Mutated Dazing Shot, you have to use it basically off cooldown, or else you lose
it takes
everything.
over.
And that was, I think for a lot of players, that wasn't very fun or
Mhm.
easy to do. You miss a game tick to lose all of the stacks you've accumulated.
Yeah, you lose all your effort.
And I think it's in a good place where your stacks retain for, I believe it's 20 seconds.
Something like that.
Could even be more than that.
At one point, it was reduced. I think it was only like 6 seconds at one point, and gaining Exsanguinate stacks reduced your Incite Fear stacks. At one point, this
so
was
in
early design. Yeah. The idea obviously being that you only used one and you kind of were set in that. But ultimately, we opened that up because it just wasn't fun to use. And that was a big thing that came out of playtesting. It was just like, just release it, make it more fun. So yeah, I did that.
Yeah. No, I think it is. I think there's some really good counterplay between being able to use both. And most players won't use both. If you do, you gain a little bit of extra power.
Exactly, yeah.
But it's not nearly in the same category as something like having to switch on a piece of gear for one ability.
Yeah.
You can actually switch to it, continue that on for a very long time. You've got, it's like 40 seconds on one spell, 20 on the other.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's a form of switchscape or an input you have to make.
Yeah.
But it feels very valuable for what it is. And also, conversely, it doesn't feel like something that you have to do. I personally don't do it and have never done it.
That's the ideal switchscape, is where you can do it, you don't have to, and you don't feel like you have to. Obviously, there is some issues with it. Spell swapping in our game's a bit clunky. It's something that I'd like to address. But it's also a kind of a cool reward space where in the future we could potentially open it up where, I don't know, you have an item that lets you have access to both at once or two different spell effects. And it just opens it up for us. Yeah,
for sure. Along with that same update, you've got, he's ready for it. He's ready for it. We've also got the Animate Dead spell.
I thought he was going to say Smoke Clouds. No, yep.
So Animate Dead changed a lot about the game, I think. I mean, the first thing it did as a positive is it gave tank gear a purpose for a lot of players, and took something that was previously seen as dead content and gave it some very, high level, effective, strong endgame use cases. And that, I mean, I think most would agree that's a positive. But it also allowed for effectively a tank based on your gear setup, as opposed to tanking based on your ability to use the combat system and the abilities that play within it. So how do you feel about that, and being able to choose to tank based on your class or your gear equipped?
This is something that I wanted very much, where if I'm playing as the tank, I'm not going in power armor, because that's kind of odd.
Yeah.
You don't actually know this, but way back when, before City of Centistan, I actually jumped in your Twitch chat and said, "Hey Ryan," or RSGuy was probably back then. "Hey RSGuy, what do you think about tank armor?" You were doing Telos at this point.
Yeah.
I was like, "What do you think about tank armor?
Oh,
do you not think it's
this.
kind of irrelevant?" And you was like, "Nah, tank armor's fine. It's used at high enraged Telos. 4K, I think players were using the Raids armor." She was like, "Oh, it has its place." And I was kind of like, it's very odd though that to go from nothing up to 90 and there's no in between. So I really wanted to give what felt like a use to tank armor, because there was no purpose to it, right?
So you're putting this on me.
This is all your fault. Every problem that there is with the tank class and Animate Dead actually, is caused by you. No, but it is I am happy with how it's performing. Obviously, it is on the strong side right now, but I like that players see it as an option, that if I want to be bulky, I can do that, and I change my gear. I don't just put on a shield and switch for 1 second and do a res switch, right?
Yeah.
Before this, in niche cases, there was tank class, but even then, you probably just shoved on a shield and power armor, right?
Yeah, I think it depends. There are certain bosses definitely across the whole game where tank gear could have had a use or could have been, needed or potentially helpful in learning, but not in the way that it is now, where if you're learning something, whether it's Crypt Bloom or it's Ganodermic, whatever it is, you're gonna be going in magic and tank gear with Animate Dead. And it reduces so much damage. I remember, this is such a niche thing. I was researching for solo Beastmaster on a super underleveled Iron Man that had garbage gear. And we did a calculation. It's an hour-long boss fight with the world's worst setup. And you're running around, and I'm doing 30k damage per minute, running around constantly.
Yep.
And in that kind of setup, we did a calculation for how many hit splats am I taking. And even though Animate Dead was only minimizing my damage taken by like 70 per hit, which doesn't seem like a whole lot.
When it adds up, it's
over the course
huge,
of the
I
full
bet.
fight, it was about 100,000 damage.
Yeah.
100,000. So yeah, for learning things, it's got its place.
Yes. Probably a bit overtuned right now. I'm sure you'd agree. I'm not super keen on how it's completely changed some metas to be like, you just AFK this thing now because you don't get enough damage.
Yeah.
But that in part, I feel like that's also kind of soul split to an extent.
Yeah.
If you had one or the other, you wouldn't be able to AFK these situations, right? You'd either be taking too much damage where soul split can't sustain you, or you'd have no sustain at all where you'd still die after a time.
I would agree with that. I think they work well together because Animate Dead allows you to take little enough damage that Soul Split, along with all the other power creep, allows you to deal enough that your HP is going to be a net positive at most bosses in the game.
Yeah. So whilst I want to do something about Animate Dead, and I do think we should to an extent, we could, for example, move where Animate Dead calculates its damage reduction to the beginning of the combat system, still at the end. As an example, say you've got a 2,000 hit incoming, you protect melee, cut that in half, and then Animate Dead knocks 500 off the end. Your end hits 500. If you throw that to the front, 2k becomes 1,500. Then half that, you take a 750. So
yeah,
it kind of doesn't scale as well with damage reduction, and that is an option. What I'd like to see before that is, there's obviously going to be people that don't like this, and this is my opinion, but if Soul Split is too strong, especially with the current DPS numbers that players can output, and whether that should be addressed first. Although there is also arguments that I'd like to see what we can do with melee and range tanks before even addressing that. Because obviously, yes, you go every situation in Magic Tank Armor now if you want to be tanky, but that's because there's no good options for range and melee, and that kind of shows where tank gear was before this, right?
Yeah.
This kind of shows the impact it can have. So what can we do with melee and range tanks that make them cool and effective and usable in all these situations?
I think when you're balancing Animate Dead or Animate Dead and Crypt Bloom, if you want to kind of bunch them all together as a tank class, do you think that one of the reasons why Crypt Bloom or Animate Dead get the label of overpowered, do you think it might be because power gear isn't actually that powerful? Because the difference between wearing full Crypt Bloom with Animate Dead and wearing your set of Tectonic, it's off the top of my head, it's about a 5% increase in damage output. So do you think another way to balance that potentially would be to, in the future, when you're looking at, reward spaces, coming out with power gear that is actually more powerful?
Yes, absolutely. There's two kind of parts to this. So one is like a high tier power armor sets, Cyrannic and whatever. They don't do anything. They're kind of trash, right? They're super vanilla. They're super boring. They don't actually impact your damage. It's like, I think the difference between Cyrannic and Elite Cyrannic is like under 1%.
Yeah, it's negligible. It's functionally the air equivalent.
So what do we do to make them more impactful? And there is some things that have been discussed on what they can be. At the same time, obviously, you don't want to push players' power too high. But there's another side of, what about making spells and buffs that impact the player with power gear, how they do, like Animate Dead impacts the player in tank gear. So like people joke around like Animate Life or something.
Animate Alive,
some stupid name
Animate
like
Alive,
that.
Classic.
But if we had something like that, or if we had some abilities that scale with how much power gear you're wearing, you suddenly split the classes more.
Yeah.
And you get more player choice in how you want to play. So I think we've got a lot of room in how we can kind of
make all power gear better.
Make all gear better.
Yeah.
More tank buffs that don't affect the power side, more power buffs that don't affect the tank side.
That's very diverse.
Exactly. Thinking things just off the top of my head, like we could do a better version of Resonance, say, that is far superior if you're wearing tank gear. So suddenly a
mean, you could
tank rotation is
argue
completely different.
Rezo already scales with shield class. It would not be, super far-fetched to make it scale with your armor rating
Exactly.
or with the type of gear that you have on.
Precisely, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us.
No
And
problemo.
we will see you in the next one.